The Galactic Collective had been humming along quite nicely for roughly 12,000 standard cycles, which was frankly miraculous considering it was composed of 89 different species who couldn't even agree on which direction was up in zero gravity. But if there was one universal truth that united every sentient being from the core worlds to the outer rim, it was this: bureaucracy was eternal, paperwork was inevitable, and everyone needed to be tested, measured, and certified for absolutely everything. The Vex'kari had appointed themselves the galaxy's premier designers of testing equipment approximately 8,000 cycles ago. And nobody had contested this because the Vex'kari were incredibly good at two things: building machines that never broke and being insufferably smug about it. Standing roughly 5 feet tall with 6 prehensile tentacles, bioluminescent skin that shifted colors based on mood, and what could only be described as an attitude problem wrapped in superiority complex. The Vex'kari had built approximately 70% of the Collective's evaluation infrastructure. Their crowning achievement was the Neural Response Evaluator Model 7500, which everyone else called that machine you have to waste 2 hours at for your work permit. The NRE 7500 was a monument to over-engineering and excessive perfectionism, standing 10 feet tall, weighing 3 tons, and costing enough credits to buy a small starship. It measured reaction time, neural processing speed, motor control, and approximately 30 other metrics that most species didn't even possess the biology to be tested for. The machine consisted of a circular platform surrounded by 12 articulated mechanical arms, each equipped with haptic sensors and force feedback systems. The whole apparatus was controlled by a quantum crystalline processor that could calculate trajectories and adjust difficulty in real time. The arms were constructed from titanium composite alloys strong enough to withstand industrial accidents. The frame was reinforced with molecular bonding and stress distribution matrices. The Vex'kari had stress-tested the NRE 7500 against every conceivable force: plasma fire, kinetic impacts, electromagnetic pulses, and one memorable incident involving a Thorian who could generate localized gravity wells. The machine had passed every test. Over 100 million beings had been evaluated by NRE 7500 units across the Collective. Not one machine had ever malfunctioned. Not one had ever been damaged. The Vex'kari had published multiple papers about their achievement, with titles like Perfect Engineering, a Case Study in Indestructible Design, and Why Our Machines Are Better Than Everyone Else's, a comprehensive analysis. Those papers were about to age like milk in a supernova. Way Station Omega-12 floated in neutral space between the Thorian trade routes and the Krill military sectors, which made it the perfect location for mandatory bureaucratic processes that everyone needed, but nobody actually wanted. The station was all brushed steel and harsh lighting, designed by committees who believed that if something wasn't actively uncomfortable, it wasn't efficient enough. The Neural Response Evaluation Center occupied the entire western hub, a sprawling facility of testing bays, waiting areas, and enough forms to constitute a fire hazard if anyone still used paper. Lead evaluator, Thexmore, had been stationed here for 4 cycles, which was approximately 3 cycles longer than anyone should be subjected to routine testing operations without losing their mind. Thexmore's bioluminescent skin currently glowed a dull blue, which in Vex'kari emotional expression meant bored to the point of existential crisis. Their 6 tentacles moved with practiced efficiency across the control interface, reviewing the day's schedule with all the enthusiasm of someone being forced to watch paint dry in real time. 23 subjects scheduled, all routine evaluations, same procedures they had overseen approximately 15,000 times before. Assistant Technician Pip. Thexmore's voice emerged as a melodic hum that their translator converted to standard language. confirmed that the NRE 7500 has completed its diagnostic cycle. Pip, a Zixian who resembled a jellyfish that had achieved sentience and immediately regretted it, floated near the secondary console with all the nervous energy of someone waiting for disaster to strike. The Zixians were known throughout the galaxy for three things: their ability to survive in environments that would kill most other species, their exceptional technical skills, and their crippling anxiety about literally everything. Confirmed, lead evaluator. Pip's voice bubbled through their translation membrane with audible nervousness. All systems operating at peak efficiency. Quantum processors stable. Mechanical arms calibrated to microscopic tolerance. Absolutely nothing is wrong, which statistically means something is about to go catastrophically wrong because that is how the universe works. Vex'kari's bioluminescence flickered orange, which meant, I am choosing to ignore that statement. They had learned early in their partnership that acknowledging Pip's anxiety only encouraged it. The morning proceeded with soul-crushing predictability. A krill warrior named Zaxthor, all crystalline exoskeleton and barely contained aggression, spread across 4 arms, completed the evaluation with scores appropriate for a species that had evolved by fighting everything that moved. The NRE 7500's mechanical arms moved in precise patterns, and Zaxthor's 4 hands struck the haptic sensors with impacts that would have dented steel. The machine absorbed every hit without even vibrating. Reaction time, 0.18 standard seconds. Perfectly normal for krill physiology. Next came a Fentari diplomat named Consciousness-Designated Formal Protocol, which was actually a brain in a sophisticated jar connected to a hover platform and various manipulator arms. The Fentari didn't technically have reflexes in the traditional sense, but collective regulations required everyone to test regardless of biological compatibility with the concept being tested. The floating brain somehow achieved 0.22 seconds, which was average and therefore acceptable to bureaucracy everywhere. A Thurian merchant scuttled through next, their insectoid body moving with mechanical precision as compound eyes tracked the sensors. 8 legs meant 8 potential strike points, and they used all of them to achieve 0.119 seconds. Then, a Quelxian engineer who was just tentacles all the way down managed 0.21 seconds. A cybernetically enhanced Vex'kari soldier whose species took military readiness to terrifying extremes clocked in at 0.14 seconds while making sounds that suggested they were enjoying themselves far too much. Every single subject hit the machine. Some hit it very hard. The Vex'kari's cybernetic fist had actually generated a small sonic boom. The NRE 7500 recorded every impact, absorbed every joule of kinetic energy, and continued operating with the serene confidence of an object that knew it was indestructible. Vex'kari watched their console with the blank expression of someone whose soul had left their body from sheer tedium. This was the problem with perfect engineering. It was absolutely mind-numbingly boring. Nothing ever went wrong. Every test proceeded exactly as designed. The most exciting thing that had happened all month was when a Gorlix had accidentally triggered the emergency stop by leaning on the wrong control. And even that had been resolved in 30 seconds. Next subject, Vex'kari announced, 3 tentacles gesturing toward the entrance, while the other 3 updated testing logs. The door slid open, and Jake Morrison walked in, looking like someone who had just been informed that yes, he did in fact have to attend that meeting that could have been an email. He was human, which was noteworthy mainly because humans had only joined the collective about 20 cycles ago, and most of them still stuck to their own star systems, apparently content to do human things in human space without bothering everyone else. Jake stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with brown hair that looked like it had been cut by someone who understood scissors theoretically, but not practically. He wore the gray and orange jumpsuit of way station cargo operations, complete with a name patch that read, Morrison, Freight Handler, Level 2. His job, as far as he understood it, consisted of using a powered exoskeleton to move shipping containers from one part of the station to another. It was honest work, paid decently, and required absolutely zero brain power beyond pick-up box, move box, put down box, repeat. Jake Morrison did not understand why someone whose entire job was move box needed their neural response time evaluated to maintain their work certification. But the collective had updated their labor regulations 6 months ago, and now everyone needed to be tested regardless of job function, because apparently bureaucracy was a universal constant that transcended species and culture. Name and work designation. Vex'kari hummed, their bioluminescence shifting to professional green. Jake Morrison, Cargo Operations, Freight Handler Level 2. Jake replied, looking around the testing facility with visible confusion. So, I'm here because my supervisor said something about mandatory certification and a bunch of other words that made my brain hurt. I move boxes. Why do I need my reflexes tested to move boxes? Vex'kari's tentacles rippled in what might have been amusement or possibly irritation. Sometimes, even other Vex'kari couldn't tell. The Neural Response Evaluator is a standardized assessment instrument designed to measure cognitive processing speed, physical reaction time, and motor control coordination across all collective species. You will stand on the central platform. When the haptic sensors activate, you will strike them as quickly as possible. The evaluation will increase in difficulty based on your performance. The entire process requires approximately 10 standard minutes. Jake looked at the 10-foot-tall machine with its 12 mechanical arms and various blinking lights, and his brain immediately filed it under over-designed garbage that definitely cost too much money. He had spent 5 years working construction in Houston before taking this station job, and he recognized expensive, unnecessary complexity when he saw it. Right, Jake said, stepping onto the platform and rolling his shoulders. Hit the things when they light up. I've played arcade games more complicated than this. Let's get it done so I can grab lunch before my shift. Pip's floating form rippled with what might have been concern. The human seems remarkably casual about the evaluation process. Is this typical for their species' behavioral patterns? Humans have demonstrated consistent tendencies toward underestimating complex situations. Vex'kari replied, manipulating controls to initialize the testing sequence. It is likely an adaptive psychological mechanism to manage stress about their own limitations. If Jake heard that, he gave no indication. He stood on the platform with his hands loose, weight balanced, looking about as tense as someone waiting for their coffee to brew. The NRE 7500 hummed to life, quantum processors spinning up, mechanical arms extending from their rest positions. Haptic sensors began glowing with soft blue light at various positions around the platform. The evaluation began at difficulty level 1, which was calibrated for species who had barely achieved spaceflight and were still figuring out which end of a tool was the handle. A single sensor illuminated at chest height. Jake's hand moved, palms smacking the sensor with a satisfying thump. Response time: 0.17 standard seconds. Vex'kari's bioluminescence flickered yellow with interest. That was faster than the Krill warrior. The test continued through level 2. Multiple sensors now, different heights and angles. Jake moved smoothly, almost lazily, tagging each one. 0.16 seconds average. Level 3 introduced moving targets. The mechanical arms repositioned sensors mid-sequence. Jake adjusted without apparent effort. 0.15 seconds. His hands moved with casual precision, like someone who had spent years grabbing things in motion without thinking about it. "Increase to level 4, Vex'kari commanded, now leaning forward with genuine interest for the first time in weeks. Level 4 was where most species began struggling. The sensors moved faster, patterns became deliberately unpredictable, and the mechanical arms created interference by moving through strike zones. Jake cracked his neck and kept hitting targets. 0.14 seconds. Then 0.13. One mechanical arm swung a sensor past his face, and his hand intercepted it with accuracy that suggested muscle memory from some activity the Vex'kari database didn't have context for. "This is unusual," Pip bubbled nervously, floating closer to their console. "The human's response time is improving during the evaluation. Biological neural adaptation requires significantly longer periods to optimize performance. This should not be happening within a single test session." Vex'kari's 6 tentacles were now fully engaged with the control system, bioluminescence cycling through interested yellows and excited greens. Fascinating. The human is not merely reacting. Observe the timing patterns. They are beginning to predict sensor positions before activation. The NRE 7500's randomization algorithm should prevent anticipatory responses. "Should" being the critical word, Pip observed with the tone of someone who had seen too many "should" statements fail catastrophically. "Increase to level 6. Vex'kari decided, scientific curiosity overwhelming common sense. Level 6 was calibrated for cybernetically enhanced soldiers and species with compound neural networks. The mechanical arms moved fast enough to blur, sensors activated in patterns specifically designed to overload visual processing, and the entire sequence was coordinated to create 3-dimensional geometry that most beings simply couldn't track effectively. Jake was starting to get annoyed. The machine was fast, sure, but there was something about the way the arms moved that reminded him of every annoying thing that had ever gotten in his space when he didn't want it there. Mosquitoes, his ex-girlfriend's cat, that one coworker who always stood too close at the coffee machine. The mechanical arms had that same quality of being persistently, irritatingly present. His reaction time stabilized at 0.12 seconds, then started dropping again, 0.11. The arms were moving in patterns, and Jake's brain was doing what millions of years of human evolution had optimized it to do: pattern recognition under pressure. The NRE 7500's randomization was based on quantum fluctuations, which made it unpredictable by computational standards. Unfortunately for the machine, Jake Morrison had spent his teenage years playing competitive gaming, and his brain had been trained to predict enemy movement based on incomplete information and educated guessing. The machine moved left. Jake's hand was already there, an arm repositioned high. Jake had already shifted his weight. A sensor swung toward his shoulder. His palm met it mid-arc with a smack that echoed through the facility. "Level 7, Vex'kari announced, their bioluminescence now bright gold with excitement. "We must gather comprehensive performance data." Pip made a sound like bubbles experiencing existential dread. "Lead Evaluator. Level 7 is typically reserved for apex predator species and special operations personnel. Perhaps we should..." "The human is performing exceptionally. This represents a unique opportunity to establish baseline metrics for their species under stress conditions. Proceed with Level 7. What Vex'kari had neglected to mention was that Level 7 was where the NRE 7500 stopped being friendly and started actively trying to hit test subjects. The haptic sensors still needed to be tagged, but now the mechanical arms functioned as obstacles and threats, swinging through zones with enough force to knock most species off the platform. It was designed to simulate combat conditions, testing decision-making under duress rather than just raw reaction speed. The arms came at Jake like a mechanical typhoon. High strikes, low sweeps, 3 simultaneous approaches. Most subjects at this level focused entirely on defense, dodging and blocking while trying to tag whatever sensors they could safely reach. The priority shifted from test completion to basic survival. Jake apparently hadn't received that memo. He ducked under an arm that would have taken his head off, pivoted, and drove his fist into a sensor hard enough to make the entire arm assembly vibrate. Another arm swung at his ribs. He deflected it with his forearm while simultaneously tagging a different sensor with his other hand. His movements had shifted from casual to focused, the muscle memory of someone who had spent time training for situations where mistakes had consequences. His reaction times held steady at 0.11 seconds, which meant he was processing and responding to threats faster than most species could perceive them happening. Thermal warnings on quantum processors 4, 8, and 11. Pip announced, voice climbing toward panic frequencies. The crystalline calculation matrices are operating at 118% capacity. The system is overheating, attempting to generate trajectory patterns complex enough to challenge the human's predictive responses. Vex'kari stared at data streams that made no sense. The NRE 7500 was designed to test subjects, not be challenged itself. The quantum processors were hitting thermal limits, not because of mechanical failure, but because they were working overtime, trying to find movement patterns that could overcome whatever bizarre pattern recognition capability human brains apparently possessed. Increase to level 8, Vex'kari commanded. And if their bioluminescence was now strobing multiple colors in ways that suggested they were making questionable decisions, they chose to ignore that warning sign. Lead evaluator, I must formally protest. Pip began. Protest noted and logged. Increased to level 8. Level 8 was theoretical. It existed in the programming because the Vex'kari were thorough to the point of pathology. But in practical application, it had never been used outside of extreme stress testing with military volunteers who had signed extensive liability waivers. This was the level designed for hypothetical scenarios involving multiple hostile opponents with lethal intent. All 12 mechanical arms activated simultaneously, moving in coordinated assault patterns while sensors flashed in sequences specifically engineered to induce decision paralysis and motor confusion. The NRE 7500 became a whirlwind of moving metal and strobing lights. Arms swung from every conceivable angle, creating a 3-dimensional cage of motion that shouldn't be possible for any biological being to track, much less respond to, effectively. Jake Morrison, who had come here expecting maybe 15 minutes of inconvenience before lunch, found himself in the middle of what his hindbrain immediately identified as a serious threat. And when the human brain decides something represents danger, it stops being polite and starts reaching into the evolutionary toolkit for solutions that had worked quite well for several million years of survival. The arms were everywhere. Too many to dodge completely, too fast to block consistently. Jake was operating on pure instinct now, conscious thought taking a back seat while older, meaner parts of his brain handled the immediate crisis. He tagged sensors when he could, deflected arms when necessary, and took exactly 4 glancing hits to his shoulders and upper back that were definitely going to bruise. And then one of the mechanical arms, moving in a strike pattern calibrated to incapacitate most carbon-based life forms, swung directly at Jake's face with mechanical precision for the 3rd time in 15 seconds. Jake stopped trying to dodge. He stopped trying to tag sensors. His brain, running on 3 million years of primate evolution and a healthy dose of pure irritation at this stupid machine that kept invading his personal space, made a decision that was simultaneously completely logical and absolutely insane. He punched it. Not a defensive block, not a deflection. A full force, weight behind it, every ounce of freight handler, strength channeled into forward momentum punch that intercepted the mechanical arm mid-swing with the kind of impact that made physics teachers weep. The sound was extraordinary. Metal shrieking in frequencies that triggered every species' danger response. Composite materials shattering under stress, loads they were never designed to handle. Quantum crystalline processors inside the arm assembly exploding as kinetic force translated through systems calibrated to deliver impact, not receive it. The mechanical arm stopped moving, which was notable. Then it bent at an angle that definitely wasn't in the original engineering specifications, which was concerning. Then the entire arm assembly tore free from its mounting bracket, with a sound like reality filing a formal complaint, which was alarming. Then the entire NRE 7500, all 10 feet and 3 tons of it, all that titanium composite alloy and molecular bonding and stress distribution matrices, made a sound that could only be described as mechanical screaming. Stress fractures spiderwebbed through the frame faster than visual processing could track. Support structures calibrated to microscopic tolerances found themselves dealing with forces applied from angles that made absolutely no sense from an engineering perspective. The machine split vertically down its central axis with a screech that would give Pip nightmares for the rest of their natural life. Sparks fountained from severed power conduits like mechanical blood. Hydraulic fluid sprayed in arcs that would have been beautiful if they weren't so horrifying. Quantum processors, suddenly exposed to atmosphere, made sounds like digital souls departing physical bodies as their cooling systems failed catastrophically. The two halves of what had been the NRE 7500, pride of Vex'kari engineering, perfect machine that had served flawlessly through 100 million evaluations, toppled to either side of the platform and crashed to the floor with impacts that registered on the station's structural integrity sensors. Silence fell across the testing facility like a blanket woven from shock and disbelief. Emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in red that made the destruction look even more dramatic. Smoke curled up from destroyed electronics. Somewhere, multiple alarms were beeping with the confused uncertainty of systems that weren't programmed to handle catastrophic equipment failure caused by test subject. Jake Morrison stood on the platform, right hand still extended from the punch, looking down at the wreckage with the expression of someone who had just realized they might have overreacted to a minor annoyance. His knuckles hurt. There was hydraulic fluid on his jumpsuit. The haptic sensors had stopped glowing, mostly because they no longer had power, but also because many of them were now scattered across the floor among approximately 3 tons of shattered machinery. "So," Jake said into the silence, voice carrying clearly through the facility, "I'm guessing that means I failed." Thexmore stood frozen, all 6 tentacles locked in various positions reaching towards controls that no longer controlled anything. Their bioluminescence had completely shut off, which in Vex'kari physiology indicated either complete system shock or imminent biological shutdown. Their eyes were fixed on the destruction, and their brain was attempting to process an event that violated every principle of engineering and physics they had spent their entire life studying. Pip had achieved a level of transparency that jellyfish-like beings should not be capable of achieving, as if they were trying to fade out of existence entirely through sheer force of anxiety. Several of their sensory organs had retracted fully into their body mass. They were making a sound like very quiet, very continuous whimpering, which was the Zixian equivalent of screaming externally, but being too polite to disturb anyone. In the waiting area, visible through transparent partitions, approximately 15 different species sat in perfect stillness. A krill warrior's jaw had literally fallen open. a Vex'kari brain's hover platform had developed a noticeable wobble. A Thorian merchant had fallen off their chair and appeared to have given up on the concept of standing. Someone's universal translator, overwhelmed by the emotional context it was attempting to process, made a sound like electronic sobbing and shut itself down entirely. Vex'kari's vocalization system finally rebooted after approximately 45 seconds of complete biological failure. The sound that emerged was something between a question and a prayer to deities they didn't believe in. How is this possible? Jake looked at his hand, flexed his fingers experimentally, and shrugged with the casual uncertainty of someone who genuinely wasn't sure how to explain what had just happened. It kept swinging at my face. I got annoyed, so I hit it. He made a vague punching motion with significantly less force than the actual event. You know, problem solving. You hit it. Vex'kari's voice climbed approximately 4 octaves, which was impressive for a species that communicated through melodic humming. The NRE 7500 was constructed from military-grade alloys with molecular bonding and redundant structural supports. It was designed to withstand industrial accidents and combat-grade weapons fire. You cannot simply hit something and have it. They gestured at the carnage with all 6 tentacles simultaneously. This! I very clearly can, Jake pointed out with the kind of logic that was technically correct, but profoundly unhelpful. Because I literally just did. You watched it happen. There's probably video. Pip had found their voice, which meant they could now articulate their panic instead of just experiencing it internally. The force required to compromise the NRE 7500's structural integrity would require sustained plasma fire or military-grade explosives. The human possesses neither of those things. The human is classified as relatively fragile, according to initial contact documentation. This violates every principle of materials science and structural engineering. Vex'kari was pulling up data on a backup console, movements jerky and mechanical, like someone going through motions, while their brain processed something fundamentally impossible. According to our sensors before their destruction, the impact force was approximately. Their bioluminescence flickered weakly. No, these readings cannot be correct. This would suggest the human delivered over 1,800 pounds of kinetic force in a single strike. That would require musculature density impossible for a species from standard gravity environments. I work in cargo, Jake offered, trying to be helpful. I lift shipping containers all day, and I've been hitting the gym more since I moved to the station. Nothing else to do during off shifts, you know? The number hung in the air, like an accusation. 1,800 pounds of kinetic force, delivered by a freight handler who moved boxes for a living and apparently went to the gym when he was bored. Vex'kari accessed Earth species documentation file, which was relatively sparse given how recently humans had joined the collective. They scrolled through entries on human biology, and their eyes gradually widened as certain details began forming a pattern they had not previously considered relevant. Humans evolved as endurance hunters on what was classified as a high-gravity death world. Check. Humans possessed unusual musculature density compared to their size, evolutionary adaptation to their planet's conditions. Check. Humans demonstrated disproportionate striking power relative to their mass due to biomechanical leverage in their skeletal structure. Check. Humans had documented history of what the file diplomatically termed percussive problem-solving, dating back approximately 10,000 cycles of their recorded history. Multiple checks with references to something called the Gordian knot, and continuing through to modern times. By the quantum fluctuations, Vex'kari muttered, all 6 tentacles scrolling through documentation with increasing speed. The file includes a behavioral note. Humans may respond to frustration or perceived threats with direct physical force against obstacles. This was categorized as a minor species quirk. It seemed minor during diplomatic evaluations. Pip bubbled defensively. All contact data was from controlled situations. Nobody tested what happens if you repeatedly swing mechanical arms at their faces. Why would anyone test that? Vex'kari's bioluminescence was now strobing red with distress. No species has ever responded to neural evaluation by attempting to destroy the testing equipment. That is not a rational response. Felt pretty rational to me, Jake said, still examining his bruised knuckles. Something kept hitting me, so I hit it back. Basic cause and effect. Vex'kari turned all their optical sensors on Jake with an intensity that would have been intimidating if they weren't still visibly traumatized. You do not solve neural response evaluation by destroying the instrument. You are supposed to complete the assessment by demonstrating adequate reaction times within established parameters. Yeah, but see, I was doing that fine, Jake explained. And then the arms got really aggressive, and one of them kept going for my face. And I'd already been at this for like 8 minutes when you said it would take 10, and I have a lunch break schedule. He trailed off, apparently realizing his explanation wasn't improving his situation. Look, I didn't mean to break your machine. It just kind of happened. It just happened. Vex'kari repeated in a flat tone that suggested their capacity for processing reality had reached its limit. 3 tons of precision engineering, tested against every possible force, certified indestructible by the finest engineers in the collective, just happened to split completely in half because you were concerned about your lunch schedule. When you phrase it like that, it sounds bad, Jake admitted. The subsequent 4 hours were a masterclass in bureaucratic nightmare scenarios. Station security arrived, reviewed the footage, called their supervisor. That supervisor watched the footage, called their supervisor. This continued up multiple management levels until eventually someone from the Collective Safety Commission got involved. And they had to contact their legal department because apparently this situation had never occurred in 12,000 cycles of standardized testing. Jake spent most of this time in the waiting area, filling out incident reports while occasionally flexing his bruised hand. His cargo supervisor had appeared at some point, looked at the destroyed machine, looked at Jake, looked back at the machine, and left without saying a single word, because language had apparently failed them. The legal determination, after extensive debate and multiple calls to various collective departments that kept insisting this couldn't possibly be their jurisdiction, was that Jake Morrison was technically not at fault. The NRE 7500 had been operating in Level 8 combat simulation mode, which included active threat protocols specifically designed to trigger defensive responses from test subjects. That the mechanical arm had swung at Jake's face multiple times was documented on video. That Jake had responded to perceived threats with force was, according to collective self-defense statutes, within his legal rights. That his response had been catastrophically effective was apparently not against any regulations, mostly because no one had ever imagined they would need regulations about it. The insurance claim became legendary. The Vex'kari manufacturers initially refused payment, insisting that biological beings couldn't damage the NRE 7500 through physical force alone. Then they reviewed the footage. Then they dispatched engineers to examine the wreckage. Those engineers spent 8 hours taking measurements, running metallurgical analyses, and performing stress calculations. Their report, submitted 5 days later, was 73 pages long and could be summarized as, "The human hit it really hard, and we didn't design it to account for that, because we didn't think we needed to account for that." There was a footnote added by what appeared to be a very tired engineer. Recommend all future equipment include protective protocols against subjects who decide violence is an acceptable alternative to test completion. Further recommend updating indestructible classification to indestructible under conditions where subjects behave predictably. Humans do not behave predictably. Jake returned to his regular duties moving shipping containers and tried not to think about the fact that he had become a station-wide legend. Aliens who had never acknowledged his existence would now stop and stare. Some took pictures. One Gorlick's merchant tried selling "I survived human evaluation" merchandise before being shut down for licensing violations. The Collective Safety Commission issued new guidelines. All NRE 7500 units required immediate upgrades with reinforced shielding and protective barriers. New warning signs appeared in 47 languages. Do not strike testing equipment. Subjects found damaging equipment through physical force will face immediate evaluation termination. Below that, someone had added in smaller text. This includes species who believe hitting things is problem-solving. Vex'kari, now stationed at a different facility, because they couldn't handle being near the empty space where the NRE 7500 had stood, led the team designing the NRE 7501. The new model included everything the previous version had possessed, plus 2 additional tons of protective measures. Mechanical arms now operated behind force field barriers. The entire system was enclosed in kinetic dampening fields that could stop small vehicles. Mounting brackets were reinforced to support approximately 5 times the original load capacity. The design documentation included a new section, Human Contingency Protocols. It was 9 pages long. PIP transferred to data analysis because they decided they preferred spreadsheets to ever again witnessing something as traumatic as watching perfect engineering become imperfect through the application of one annoyed human. They were reportedly much happier, though they still experienced anxiety episodes whenever anyone mentioned reflex testing. Jake eventually completed his certification at a different station using an NRE 7501 prototype. The test was conducted behind multiple protective barriers, and attending technicians monitored everything from a separate room. He passed with scores rated as exceptional but concerning, and received certification with a note in his file. Recommend advanced evaluation for potential special operations recruitment. Jake declined because he liked moving boxes and special operations people seemed stressed all the time. 6 months later, the Collective published updated species integration documentation. The human entry now included: humans are endurance predators from high-gravity environments who evolved by persistently pursuing prey until exhaustion. Their physiology grants unusual strength relative to mass and notable problem-solving adaptability. However, when frustrated or perceiving threats, humans may engage in what their species terms percussive maintenance. This involves applying physical force to obstacles until obstacles cease being problematic. While historically successful for humans across various scenarios, note that not all problems are solved by hitting them. A footnote concluded, despite conventional wisdom, apparently some problems are solved by hitting them if the being doing the hitting is sufficiently strong and motivated. Account for this possibility in all equipment stress testing. The Galaxy had operated on certain assumptions for 12,000 cycles. Things were measured according to standardized protocols. Equipment was designed with predictable parameters. Species behaved according to documented patterns that made sense. Then, humanity joined the Collective and demonstrated that sometimes the answer to complex problems wasn't careful analysis or sophisticated tools or creative thinking. Sometimes the answer was just punching it really hard and seeing what happened. The Vex'kari eventually recovered from having their engineering pride shattered along with their perfect machine. The NRE 7501 went into production and served well for years, with only minor incidents involving humans who got annoyed and needed reminding that violence wasn't always the answer, even when it occasionally was. But there, in testing facilities across collective space, mounted beside safety procedures and operational guidelines, new signs appeared. They showed a stylized hand in a stop gesture, with text beneath, "Do not punch the equipment." And below that, in smaller letters added after careful consideration, "Yes, even if it's in your face, especially if it's in your face. Just don't." The universe was vast and complicated, full of wonders and thousands of species trying to coexist according to rules that made sense. And then there were humans, who occasionally reminded everyone that rules and standards and careful calibrations meant nothing if someone got annoyed enough to just break the problem in half and call it a solution. The NRE 7500 had been indestructible, right up until it met Jake Morrison on a day when he was running late for lunch. Some lessons needed to be learned the hard way, or in this case, learned by being punched into several thousand pieces.